Well, first of all, I want to thank everyone for coming, and especially the organizers, USC. This has really been one of the most fun collaborations I've been engaged in, and a big part of it is getting to travel around and continue the conversation. We actually had an event at the AAG, the Geographers meeting yesterday, and we have a little bit more time today, so it's interesting to see how each of these presentations is evolving slightly in the way of, in the manner of a continuing conversation. So in that spirit, I am presenting some of the material that is in my book chapter, and I am taking a slightly different approach to it, specifically in light of yesterday's conversation and with Vinayak's provocation, particularly about the alternative approaches to the city. And I just want to, in true proper academic tradition, challenge the notion of this being alternative. In a way, that very language itself establishes a hierarchy that privileges the viewpoints of institutions such as planning programs. Architecture programs are notorious for this. And if you come at this from the perspective of residents of places, the alternative view is coming from the outside. Unlike actual everyday experience, theory has to prove itself. The outsider view, the technical views, these should not be taken for granted as being proper and just and valid in and of themselves. They actually have the burden of proof. They have to prove themselves useful. And what do we mean by useful? It's not about truth necessarily. This is a little controversial. And it's not about elegant mental models. This is about actual real consequences on the ground. And one of my favorite things about this collaboration is that there is an attempt to challenge what is starting out, the kernel of this group is a group of academics with our handicaps on full display of being overly enthusiastic about elegant theories and beautiful models that make sense on paper. This is one of our challenges, because our predisposition is to go with what makes sense from our own frameworks. But the true location of authority, which is the lens I want to come at this from, is not the outside. We share in common much with other outsiders, colonial rulers, centralized national governments, technocratic regimes all over the world, economic development models, all of these things, institutions such as the World Bank. We are in the same group as them to a large extent in terms of our structure. We are outsiders to a large extent. The challenge is to properly locate authority where the action is and where it really matters. So my case is the city of Surakarta in central Java. When I was an architecture student, this is part of the framing. Part of this framework is informed by a recently emerging effort that is coming out of the university community. It goes by the acronym URBAN, which stands for Urban Research-Based Action Network. And the challenge that this group is posing to itself and its collaborators on the ground in communities all over North America is to develop theory that is useful, to develop theory out of actual lived experience within these communities, and to constantly challenge those models for their usefulness, and usefulness defined from the authority, which is the local inhabitants. Some would say, someone encourages us to go even further and locate the least empowered members of those communities, the children, the women, that these are the tests, the indicator species that we as outsiders need to pay attention to evaluate the success or failure of our our measures. So as a naive young architecture student, I suddenly realized it wasn't about the building, it was about the space the building creates. And so I learned Italian, was ready to go off to Rome, and got distracted by this photograph of a gate in a Javanese neighborhood, and said, oh my God, no one studied this. Rome has been done. So I learned Indonesian, got a 3-month grant, showed up. I found the Jakarta capital city, was very familiar, and I said, oh look, it's like Cincinnati. This is very familiar. There really is just one single urban paradigm. Yes, I made that mistake. Here's the president. It's all about development. And they have these nice ancient monuments. Of course, the communities that constructed these monuments are all long dead and gone. Also very comfortable for me. That's what I'm familiar with. We live in the modern world in North America, and there's a rupture that separates us from the traditional communities. But then something weird happened. As I wandered around the neighborhood, I was told, oh, this is just a house of a noble who was part of the palace. And I said, palace? And they said, yeah, just go over there, there's a palace. And so I went over there, and I said, who are you? And he turns out he's a prince. And there's lots of princes, and there's a king, and 6 wives, and 36 princes and princesses. And so I thought, oh, this is nice. They live in this house that's breaking down under its own weight. But of course, it doesn't mean anything. But I learned quickly that this is where the challenge began, that this did not fit at all in what I expected. And the message here is about what I learned from the examples I ran into is that there is a process of constant transformation, a constant reinterpretation of cultural forms and the meanings that accrue to those cultural forms. And these forms and meanings accrue to a large extent through the activities, the action, the engagement of human bodies and human communities engaging with these built environment elements. And the meaning of these places is transformed by that activity. And so I learned about the Hindu because globalization turns out, this was another lesson, globalization turns out is not new. That South Asian contact with Java developed this remarkable hybrid cultural formation of Hindu-Javanese culture. The Hindu-Javanese roof form was then translated into an Islamic mosque of a form that is unique anywhere in the world. The Dutch came and the Middle East, and you see the brass band. You see the Dutch tailcoats that were snipped in order to accommodate the required short sword. And this is authentically Javanese within the context of Java. One of the most important linguistic terms in the culture is the verb to Javanize. It's a very conscious activity that occurs over time when these elements are introduced. Thus, the carriage that was a gift from the Queen of the Netherlands to the King of Java was christened Kiai Garuda Kencono and played a very important role thus in the commemoration of Hindu-Javanese calendar and ritual cycles. It is no longer a Baroque European carriage. It is a sacred, charged element of power that is part of the larger operation of maintaining the balance between heaven and earth. All good fortune flows through the center of the palace, and these rituals maintain the proper flow of good fortune from heaven to earth. Thus, when they wash the cannon in this pavilion, the water is collected, and women compete with each other to gather up the dirty water, to spread it on the fields, to drink it if their kids get sick, to whatever it takes to keep things away. The palace itself is no gem. It is not palatial in the conventional sense. Its importance derives primarily from its role as an instrument of maintaining this balance of heaven and earth. It itself is a cosmological model. When something goes wrong in one part of the palace, an offering, when something goes wrong in one part of the realm of Java, a famine, an earthquake, an uprising, the palace itself is an instrument of correcting that imbalance. And so a ritual will be performed in the related model, the analogy of that portion of the kingdom. And so the Hindu linga and yoni, sexual organs symbolically represented here, are deployed in a celebration of Muhammad's ascension to heaven and paraded through the palace grounds, through specific spaces from this inner palace to the outer palace where the mosque is. And at the end of the ceremony, it is torn to shreds, again, to gather the good fortune that accrues from these sacred rice cakes and fruit that are part of the float. The Javanese New Year's ceremony was one of the most spectacular events. People walk in from all over the realm to be present as the sacred objects are paraded around the palace following a herd of white buffalo. And it's important to go at the same pace of the buffalo, so sometimes the parade would take 3 or 4 hours, sometimes it would be over in 20 minutes, depending on how fast the buffalo went. And when the buffaloes relieved themselves on the streets, again, people would break ranks and gather up the excrement or the urine in order to take it home. When I arrived, there was an interesting role of the local university, offering their expertise on how to preserve these valuable assets of the palace. And so they used the world-class established standards of colonial Williamsburg in Virginia. And if you know it, I don't have to explain, that basically the village, there was research on the village, they reconstructed it, they hired people to play the role of colonial subjects of early times in the United States history, and they interact with tourists pretending not to know what a camera or a cell phone is. And so in that model, the harem, the home of the 6 wives of the king, which is one of the only parts of the palace that my documentation did not cover because I was never allowed in, would be converted into a 5-star hotel. There'd be a shopping complex, of course, and when there was a hunger strike and protests from the villagers or from the college students, a few of us developed a alternative model based more on the living culture of the Issei Shrine, where the decay of this wooden structure was counteracted by a ritual cyclical reconstruction of it, and the living culture of the craftspeople that support this reconstruction takes on a larger role than the building itself in some cases. And so in our model, the king, who had been in the habit since colonial times, he was coronated at a young age in 1942 during Dutch colonial rule just prior to the Japanese invasion. And he followed the tradition of Javanese power, which was to defer to threats of power in order to survive, as a strategy for survival. And so he took the same approach, which is resonating with my opening remarks. He took the same approach with outsiders offering aid. So when the Japanese came to help restore the library, he said, please, be my guest. And the Japanese came in, they restored the library in 2 months, and they left. No training, no maintenance plan, no budget. They really was a hit-and-run aid program. And this was the pattern that had repeated itself over and over again. What we did instead is we followed all of the traditions. We did the research that would normally be done about what was the high point, what was the right paint color. We examined the wood chemistry, the paint composition, all of these proper scientific approaches. And then we said to the king, this is what we recommend, but you're the king. You are the source of authority. If we come in and restore the buildings, which remember are not that great in and of themselves, and undermine your authority in the process, then it is questionable whether this is a net gain. We were able to get the entire community of 36 children of the king together in a single room, which I was told afterwards was the first time that had ever happened. And this gave us great hope that we were actually developing the carrying capacity of this community on the ground, and using the buildings as an excuse, as a vehicle for actually doing this. So in contrast to my training as an architect, the buildings were not the most important thing. And so we followed all of the right steps. The carpenter is also the priest, and every detail, every element of the buildings have dual citizenship as functional, structural, tectonic elements and religious symbols. And so the acknowledgement of this as a living community was something that we left at the end of our project, which was supported by the Aga Khan Award for Architecture. We held the annual awards ceremony there. And it lives on today. They've just recently settled, while I was there last summer, struggle for succession after the last king died. And it continues to live on in all its sloppy, inelegant, hodgepodge muddling through, and hopefully will continue. This model, what we learned from this, applied when I took students from around various schools in the Northeast around Boston. We went to Aceh, Sumatra after the tsunami. This is the before and after picture of the village where we worked. And the population numbers went down dramatically, as you can see. We turned down the offer to work in the air-conditioned studios of the local university that was not affected by the tsunami, and instead we went and worked in the lean-to pavilion, the structure on the location of the village, where the village had been, and worked on village mapping and village land readjustment projects where we redistributed the lands of survivors so they could reconstruct in close proximity to the mosque, as was the custom before the disaster. And so we led the students through the process of working with the surviving community to develop this. And one of the results, when the engineers who came from Australia told us, we cannot let these people rebuild their homes. They will do it wrong. We have to stop them. And when we said, hey, we need to rebuild 200,000 homes, and it's going to be a long slog if you don't let them rebuild their own houses, he said, it's unethical for us to allow them to rebuild their homes. One of the architecture students we worked together to make a comic book that would teach them all about the dangers of locating buildings in the wrong place or building it improperly. And the comic book was supported and distributed widely throughout the region. We ended up, the governor of Aceh province, who had been a former rebel commander, but the tsunami catalyzed the end of the rebellion, and he became the newly elected governor. He declared August of 2005, right after we were there, to be Village Planning Month based on our model, and he deployed what we did in over 600 villages. And so this approach can be very powerful, and it can empower the people who live there. And that's something I was used to saying until it was pointed out to me, excuse me, who are you? You're going to empower me? How about this? Why don't you just skip the step where we're disempowered? Because we actually start with the power. Thank you very much. Let's just skip that step where we become disempowered. When I teach these things in the context of the history of architecture and urbanism, it somehow refers back to what was wrong with the 20th century model of modernism and how we can do better. The rigid visions of utopian modernism of the 20th century did not go well, But that doesn't mean we're living in a postmodern world, despite what Charles Jenks says. That in my work in this article, I propose that a more useful model is that the fundamental urge, the fundamental mission of modernity never went away. We just got distracted for a few decades there. It's back with a vengeance. The 21st century, what characterizes the 21st century that makes it different from the 20th century is not that we're no longer trying to spread the greatest benefits to the greatest number of people, which was what we had a clear vision of at the beginning of the 20th century. It's just how we do it. And even the mainstream architecture establishment has been compelled to acknowledge with the Venice Biennale last year with their shift of theme. And so it really does boil down to this type of model. And there was reference yesterday to an example in Medellin, Colombia, and I just wanted to quickly show what this looks like. I know this is Latin America, not Asia, but I claim that Asia has a lot to learn from Latin America. This is the murder rate. The orange line is the murder rate of Medellin, Colombia during the high point of the drug years, and then its decline with the success of the programs, and more recently, the mayoral candidate promised to stop stealing money and to make Medellin the most educated city in Latin America. And so he did that by relocating. So his main focus was on schools. And this is the important thing. It would be easy to misperceive this as being about good architecture. It's not. It's about education and services and transportation infrastructure and granting dignity to the least privileged members of the community. Architecture, it turns out, can be an extremely convincing demonstration that poor people matter. And so they located where all the corpses were found, and wherever the most corpses were, they built a library park using world-class, quote-unquote, architecture, and they relocated the fancy cable car mass transit system from the neighborhoods of the well-to-do. He's kept that project but just moved it to where the most corpses were and transformed the community in the process, making it very safe, giving children access to everything. Controversially for us, for the outsiders, they didn't change the housing at all. He had 4 years to do it. He said, listen, the houses are fine. The community said, thank you very much. We'll keep our houses just the way they are, but give us what we need, which was facilities. There's also the flashy architecture, and I'll say, even though it is flashy architecture, it is not damaging to the community. It actually is a source of dignity. Science center, public art, and just the final image is what perhaps could be the new PowerPoint of academia. Instead of showing slides to each other in darkened rooms, this group, which is part of the Urban Research-Based Action Network, Urban, in a collaboration between academics and community organizers, project these things on the sides of buildings, inviting people to be part of this process and mobilizing the results of research to raise awareness and to claim the rights to the city of the people in these communities. Thank you very much. How do you convince school administrations to allow you to take these students?
That wasn't even an issue at all. I mean, it's actually the schools are trying to internationalize, and they're actually creating this infrastructure to encourage, faculty to take students abroad. So it wasn't even a question that came up. It's actually how do you actually do it in a meaningful way, that you don't just, these don't become just academic tourism. Right? You actually are engaged in kind of critical inquiry on the ground, and so that's.
I like
Is
that.
that a good start? Yes.
We perceive it as a problem when the Chinese are destroying some of these older sections of the city. We perceive that as a problem. And there may be some, I think for sure there's some debate in China as to whether that is the way to go or not. And I wonder, how do you enter as an outsider with some expertise? How do you enter into a debate like that?
Okay. The actual the phenomenon of kind of this neighborhood being demolished is actually quite complex. It's not just people's right to the city being taken away. Actually, there are people who would like to be much prefer to move elsewhere and just take the money. And so it's actually much more nuanced than just kind of this one-sided interpretation that somehow these neighborhoods are being displaced. And they are being displaced, but there are people who do benefit.
Well, I wonder whether they have a right.
Yeah.
You could argue that they don't have a right. That there's some higher.
Well, they do have the right now. I mean, the private property is not protected in China under the Constitution, so they have the right. It's just a matter of the process, how decisions are made, how much people are being compensated, and those kind of issues. And so when we, and that's, I think, the thing that we'd like to challenge is still a very kind of paternalistic, kind of power structure that everything's been decided for you, and we see our role as somebody who are able to come in and there's some kind of privilege that we have as outsiders, and we actually were brought in purposely because of our status as outsiders often. To leverage the kind of power that the local community don't often have. And so we're conscious of our role in this kind of ambivalent kind of way. But constantly kind of question whether what we do is ethical or not. But I think there's, but at some point you need to make a decision, that you are in or you are out, okay? If you're out, you can just continue to kind of critique the situation and be fine with that. But if you decide that you want to be engaged, then you have to be engaged. You have to work with the local people. And one project that we did in China, and it was after the earthquake in 2008. We went there a year after the earthquake, and we were actually the first professional group who went to the site. And we didn't know about this until the British told us. That was the first group that came in and engaged in the conversations. And that was the first time that things like that has ever happened in this particular context. And it was quite empowering. I mean, people realized that they could actually discuss things in open. And we actually presented with different alternatives, and there was and things that would never been talked about in the open. There was a plan for the government to basically reconstruct everything, but in this kind of touristy kind of caricature manner. And at the same time, it's a cultural heritage site, so people continue to live in tents. So we came in and we argued that that there are actually other ways to kind of to rebuild the village, taking into account the farmlands, how that should be preserved, rather than giving everything to tourism development and subject the local villagers to the tourism economy. And so that was something that we were able to do because we were outsiders, and we were definitely conscious of that. And then we're also conscious that we're going to leave at some point. But what do you do? I mean, you either do nothing or you do something. And so that's a continuing kind of struggle that we have.
And just quickly, when we went to Sumatra, we did land readjustment. Those of you who understand that, it typically requires a spreadsheet in AutoCAD or GIS mapping. And we said, no, we can do this with a pad of paper and colored pieces of a pad and paper to do the math, and colored pieces of paper that are scaled to different sizes. And we actually didn't propose a solution. We worked with the survivors next to them, and we did it together to the point where they were comfortable doing it themselves. And then at the end, every day we'd do a new one, and we'd step back, and we showed the results of the 6 days of doing these. And in a way, we broke the rules and didn't give them a final solution. We just said, okay, now you know how to do it, go ahead and do it, and ended up being more powerful. And the other thing we did is we would listen to what the people said, and often you're the first, as foreigners especially, as outsiders, you might be the first people who actually listen and ask questions and show an interest. And then to the extent that these voices can be amplified when repeated through a different apparatus, the outsiders, it can actually make all the difference. And if you're lucky, it will make some kind of a difference.
Anyone else?
So have you asked your students what they learned from it?
Yes, we ask them to. We often ask them to write some kind of reflective essay in the end, and they always talk about how it's kind of a life-changing experience. I mean, this is something that comes up often, very often. And some people talk about how they become much more conscious about themselves being outsiders, and that goes back to the question before. And how do you kind of navigate that, the complexity of their role in, and also the limited kind of time frame they were able to kind of spend engaging in the local community. So these kind of questions come up in their reflection actually, and there's, there actually, as most of us know, there's no perfect answers, but I think as long as they begin to kind of question kind of their role and kind of our role as kind of practitioners in this kind of scenarios, I think we'll do something good.
Yeah, just to add a little bit, students I've taken as part of a class seem to constantly be asking themselves, well, does this count as school? And they're unsure all the way through, but in retrospect, they see it. The work in Sumatra was a different kind of student that they actively pursued the opportunity to do this. As a matter of fact, several students went to their programs and said, can we have funding and course credit? And the response was, you can't have funding, you can't have course credit, and if you go, we'll kick you out of school because this is a dangerous thing, and we can't allow any of our students, we can't risk any of our students getting in trouble. So they were much more motivated, and they also saw it as a life-changing experience.
Do any of your students or any of your programs go back and have continuing relationships, and what's that like?
So a lot of the overseas work I do, we don't often have the opportunity to go back, and these are kind of, a lot of times you have to work with this kind of one-off kind of opportunities. But we do try our best in terms of kind of working with a local community organization so they continue to kind of carry on the work that we have done. I did go back to the community in Japan, and the students, we now have some funding from the Japanese university to bring our students to there, and so they continue to kind of engage in the community. So they're, the kind of work, these are really small scale interventions, and so that we're able to kind of continue that process. Other faculty in my department have done work in Peru that have continued, and these are. Those kind of relationships it's really hard to kind of develop, and because people come and go, fundings come and go. So he was fortunate to kind of find a footing in the community in Lima. This is in a slum community. Has been working there for 4 years. My own work has been mostly based in Seattle. So I work with the Asian American community there for over almost 11, 12 years now. So that I chose to kind of spend more time in Seattle rather than overseas.
In the Sumatra group, 2 of them just stayed. They didn't come home. They extended their stay, and it was indefinite at the time. And after a month or more than close to 2 months, finally their families convinced them to come home. Another person is now young woman is now back in Indonesia working within the aid community, and that's her career now. So,
yeah, and I have one student who ended up getting the PhD in Kobe University and has been working with the post-disaster kind of effort in after Fukushima.
yeah.
Okay, we're out of time?
Yeah.
Okay.
I think we should end the first panel.
Okay.
Okay, great.
Okay.
Thank you.
Thank you.